For my experiment, I decided to go with the question, how does light affect the atmosphere within a scene? In order to carry this out, I had one subject in front of a black backdrop playing the same piece of music as a control, with the only difference being the lighting setup, in order to see whether or not we, as the audience, perceive what we're being shown differently. When looking at my lighting setups, I tried to find opposites in order to show comparisons more easily. Enjoy! The way in which a scene is lit has always been a particular interest, I find. I personally felt that the way a scene is lit has such an impact on the way the story is told, whether it be from really dark and twisted lighting in a horror film to bright and sunny in a rom-com. They always have a very particular look to them, and that's something that I really wanted to look into further for my experiment. When it came to researching and preparing for this experiment, one of the books I read was called Making a Blockbuster. Within this, there was a section which practically explained three-point lighting. Within the diagram, we can see how it explains the 45-degree angle rule, and on top of this, it helped me to get a better understanding of how to classically light someone, and thus I knew in my experiment I'd be using this as a base and then building off of it. I also looked into various websites which had a variety of articles that were very helpful in giving a breakdown of what the different aspects are that you need to look at. So for this piece, I made sure I was keeping myself aware of the intensity, the direction, and the color of light, which thus also made me aware of the amount of contrast that was being shown and making sure I had full control over the different looks that I was trying to produce. I even made sure to speak with industry professionals who had experienced lighting subjects, getting their own advice on how best to light and the different ways in which you can tweak lights ever so slightly just to create a whole different look within the scene. I took this advice and I applied it to my project. This can be shown with my different uses of backlight, tweaking it ever so slightly from the diagonal of the subject to directly behind the subject, which creates a whole different look to the piece. I also took inspiration from was the cinematographer Luciano Tavelli, who was the cinematographer for the 1977 film Suspiria. I really loved his big use of colour, which really made different scenes pop, and I wanted to take this and use it as inspiration for my own scene. However, there were some tweaks that I made for my project. I added a white light to counter the colour, to add a bit more variation to my scene, whereas in Tavelli's work we see a lot of just solid colour. Finally, I also actually looked back into my old photography work where I'd done creative lighting experiments in the past. A theory that I also looked into was the Kuleshov effect, where we have the same footage of a man's face and then it shows different scenes after, and we as an audience interpret the same face differently. I wanted to take this and tweak it slightly. I decided to have the same subject and same music and thus change only the lighting setup to see whether it created the same effect. At the beginning of my experiment, taking what I learned from the book as well as industry professionals, I started out with a classic 3-point lighting setup for which I used a ARRI 300 with a diffuser and neutral density gel over it as my key light, and then I used a light panels caliber as my backlight, and then just using a reflector to bounce light for my fill. From this point, I then tweaked and built upon my lighting using the same positionings for the key light and the backlight for some of my other setups, such as when I used the coloured gels, which I still kept the same 3-point lighting. I sometimes had to use a mix of gels in order to achieve the tone that I wanted for the piece. One of the issues that I came across was that I was putting blue gels on a tungsten bulb, which of course cancelled it out and gave it a daylight colour temperature balance. So thus, in order to get the look that I wanted, I had to use more saturated gels and layer them up a couple of times so that I then balanced it to daylight and then pushed it further into the colour blue that I wanted. Other lights that I used for my shots, such as my high-angled backlight and high-angled front light, were the Manfrotto Luminos 8, and for the controlled high-key low-contrast lighting, I used the Aputure LS 1/2 bounced up into the ceiling. What I feel went well were the comparisons that I was able to make between my lighting setups. As I said, I tried to use opposites where possible. 3 comparisons I was particularly happy with were when I used just a backlight and a backlight with a bounce, which showed a nice mix of intensity. How a backlight does add a more solemn feel, but if you take away the bounce, it becomes even more intense. Another one I liked was comparing my high-angled center backlight compared to my high-angled center front light, illuminating him completely but also erasing a lot of the shadows that he had on his face, or creating a very silhouetted look. Another one that I was really particularly happy with comparison-wise was the 2 different high-key low-contrast setups I did. For one of them, I had complete control over the lights and how they were hitting my subject. For the other one, I used daylight coming in through the window and used a bounce just to even out the contrast a bit. And the only light that I kept was the backlight just to keep the separation from the background. This, I feel, actually had quite a significant difference. The natural lighting seemed to have just a much more warmer feel to it. On top of this, when it came to the natural lighting, I was also taking inspiration from the artist Rembrandt, which I learnt about in my cinematography lectures, who had a very key lighting style to his paintings, where he had one natural light source, often a window, and a little bit of bounce coming back onto the subject. This often created a triangle of light within the face. I don't think I quite achieved this with my subject because the amount of light coming in from the window was too great. Other than that though, I really liked the natural lighting look that I got. However, something that I feel didn't go well was the fact that I had to reshoot my experiment. When it came to the first day of shooting, I didn't position things quite right, and an example of this is when I did my original 3-point lighting setup. I didn't position the backlight nor have it at the intensity that I needed, so that when you look through the camera, it's almost non-visible and my subject starts to blend into the background. However, I learned from this experience, and thus when I came to the reshoot the next day, I learnt that I have to make sure that I turn off the other lights whilst I'm adjusting so that I can clearly see where and how much the light is hitting the subject, and I was much happier with how the outcome was in the end. If I was to go back and redo it, I would definitely add a variety of more creative ways of lighting. Within this experiment, I definitely feel I covered the basics with the high key low contrast, primary colours, but I feel there was so much more I could have done in the sense of I could have experimented with using light, reflecting it in different ways, or adding a mix of colours, giving a different blend, even working with shadows, using cookies or flags to really shape the shadows how I want to create an even more dramatic effect. I definitely feel I've improved at my craft now because through this experiment I've been able to play about with lights and gain a better understanding of how light interacts with the subject, which definitely then has an impact on how we view the subject. I also feel I've gained a lot more knowledge on how to control lights and make sure they turn out the way I want. I've learnt more about colour correction. For example, with my high key low contrast controlled lighting, I put a CBO gel over my LED light, which then colour balanced it to the tungsten ARRI, so there was no mix of blues and orange, and I was able to then white balance on the camera correctly. But I think the best way to continue furthering the skills is with more experiments. Of course, definitely read books, talk to fellow practitioners, but also I feel the best way for me to do it is just get hands-on. I need to find small projects, where I'm able to focus on a particular area of lighting and really delve deep into picking apart every little bit of it, every tweak, every type of angle I can take, and learning hands-on and just experimenting through trial and error the best ways to light things. And I feel this will help me so much in becoming a better cinematographer.